Jane and Pia over there made the reception happen, as well as the room and a million other things, and so we're very grateful. And then, of course, the debate team captain, Austin, and all the UCLA debate union members who did thousands of hours of work to make this happen. It's really, really wonderful amount of dedication, and I appreciate it very much. We have a tradition when we start a debate, for when teams come from another nation, we exchange gifts. And it's a reminder of the civility that we want to maintain both before the debates and after the debates. As some of you may know, we recently lost a Supreme Court justice, and a very interesting fact about that gentleman was that one of his best friends was a woman on the court that he disagreed with vehemently, and yet they went out together, shot birds together, had lunch together, and yet could go into the courtroom, argue, disagree to the ninth, and yet still go and have a martini afterwards and be friends. In short, they learned to disagree without being disagreeable, and we want to set that tone for this debate today, and we'll do that by starting this debate by the exchange of some gifts between the Chinese delegation and the U.S. team represented by the UCLA Debate Union and our UCLA team captain, Austin Cady. So would you like to begin first? Yeah, great. Go ahead. Time to give the gifts. Keep giving them, yeah. Well, we got to give theirs first. Okay, go ahead.
This is actually for Bolivia.
Thank you. Appreciate it very much. Yeah, now, we're giving gifts now, yeah.
Yeah, so,
UCLA t-shirts.
Don't you think you should hold them up so everyone can see how beautiful they are? Yeah. Yeah, thank you. They will shine and shine, I guess. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much. And these gifts are symbols of something really very important, and the importance of civility in discourse. And we appreciate you coming, and thank you very much for the gifts that you've shared with us. Next, what I would like to do is give you a little introduction to the students that will be debating today. And if you could stand up as I say your name, I'll tell you a little bit about what these students do. In no particular order, except in the order they're speaking. Well, sort of. Let's start with the UCLA team captain, Austin Cady. He's a third-year microbiology and immunology major. It makes me tired saying it. Comes from Orange County. Has a passion for public health reform and microbiological research and speaking. He has planning to graduate from a very difficult major in 3 years. He's debated for 9 years since high school. He has spoken at the United Nations. He's appeared extensively with the UCLA debate team on the circuit. Recently he appeared at Politicon, where we met one of our former debaters' sons. Many of you may not know this, but Frank Mankiewicz, who was Robert F. Kennedy's press secretary, who announced his death when he was shot by Syrian here in Los Angeles. Son, Josh Mankiewicz, was in Los Angeles at Comic-Con, so we got the opportunity to meet him there when we did a debate there against USC. Austin also is researching, and his passion is to look for an efficacious TB booster vaccine. He works in Professor Horowitz's lab at UCLA and uses his hands-on experience in debate whenever possible. He's received numerous awards for UCLA. He's represented us at nationals. He was a semi-finalist at the Western Regional competition and won the fall champs in 2015. That's Austin. Next is Joe. This is Joe Kahn. Hi, Joe. Joe is a third-year comparative and civics engagement student at the University of California. He plans on earning a postgraduate education in gender studies and the law. Quite a combination. He's taught debate and at the college level for 2 years, and he says he loves to debate and argue, but only with smart people. We all feel that, huh? Before he attended UCLA, Joe was a transfer from Santiago Canyon College, where he was the captain of the team there. He did numerous individual events as well as debating events and won state and national medals in those events. He was also awarded the prestigious Carl Brovero Award in Excellence in Competition and Service for Debaters. He also, along with his partner Austin, took first place in the fall champs. And he said, he lives by the motto, consider the rights of others before your own feelings, and feelings of others before your own rights. So that's Joe Kahn. Now we have Austin's partner, Vidya. Hi, Vidya. Vidya is a second-year economics major at the University of California. She joined the debate team in her freshman year. We're very happy to have had her join, and we've really, it's been my personal pleasure to see her develop and grow. We have great expectations for Vidya as she grows and develops each year. So I'm pleased that she came back for more abuse in her second year on the team. She first started debating in high school, where she participated in many regional tournaments, such as the Julia Barbell Debate Competition, and she also competed at the junior college level. She took first place in the Singapore Management University competition. In addition, Vidya does volunteer work, which she pursues as part of the United Nations Association. After she graduates, she wants to continue and get an advanced degree in economics. That's Vidya. Hi, Vidya. Also hailing from the same sort of part of the world is Pratik. This is Pratik. Pratik is a biz-econ, sorry about that, that's what I call it, business economics major at the University of California, Los Angeles. He plans to pursue a career in management consulting or public accounting. Over his 2 years in college here at UCLA, he's been a semifinalist at the Steeltown Debate Invitational and at the UCLA Debate Invitational, and was a top speaker at other invitationals as well. Pratik has dedicated his time to research. He's also a member of the Finance Club. He's an avid debater, and he said he really enjoys meeting teams and schools and debaters from other countries. That's Pratik. So now it's time to meet the Chinese team. Let's start with Tammy. Hi, Tammy. Tammy is a senior, English major, and upon graduation, she's going to pursue postgraduate degrees in law. Yay. Another lawyer, huh? She now works as a chief trainer of the English Debating Society. She trains junior debaters through regular meetings in her own institution. You have to know something to teach it, don't you? So it's good work to judge and to teach. During college, Tammy has highly engaged in various English competitions, especially in debating. She won 3rd place at the 5th and 6th annual China Open Debates, 2nd place in the National English Competition, 1st place at the IDEA National Tournament, semifinalist, best speakers, 1st place at the Cornell Cup. There's a very long list here. You get the idea. Tammy has just achieved a great deal of excellence in her speaking. But that's not all that she does. At least she thinks she's not well-rounded. She also has a good command of the piano. Yay, we'll have to ask her to do that for us. And English. And she brings great happiness to orphanages and teaches English in primary school around her city. It will be a great honor to meet with the debaters from the U.S. and other countries, she said, and she's really looking forward to enjoying her tour of the U.S. That's Tammy. Hi, Tammy. Next, we'll meet Kathy. Hi, Kathy. Kathy is a senior also, majoring in English at Beijing Foreign Studies University. She will produce a postgraduate studies field of international law upon graduation. She is also the captain of the BFSU English Debating Society. She also works training and judging other students at her institution, which is really good work. She also has won numerous awards. There's a long list here. She won 1st and 2nd at the Malaysia Debate Open, and quarterfinalist twice at the national tournament. So she's got a great competition record under her belt. But that's not all there is to Kathy. Kathy is a film and literature lover. She qualified as a literature teacher, one of the best high schools in Beijing. It's worth mentioning that her passion is filmmaking. And for the first time, she's honored to be blessed to be in this country under the guidance of able to pursue another one of her passions. This is Kathy. Hi, Kathy. Welcome. Next, we have Neo. Hi, Neo. Neo is also a senior, majoring in English. He is admitted to continue postgraduate studies at Hunan University in the field of interpretation. He is devoted to training and debate on this campus, and he is currently president of the English Debate Society. In his career, he's participated in many regional tournaments and a finalist at the IEDA tournament. He also has done many other academic events. He did the National Model APEC Conference. He also works as an interpreter. So that is Neo. Last but not least is Annie. Hi, Annie. Save the best for last. Annie is a second-year student from the School of English and International Studies at Beijing Foreign Studies University. She plans on participating in international exchange programs during her junior year. She loves debating and always likes to see problems in a different light. She's in her third semester of competition. She was an octa-finalist at the Beijing Debate Challenge, semi-finalist at the Hong Kong Parliamentary Debate Summer Workshop, and a quarter-finalist at the Northeast Asian Open. She looks forward to doing more and more debate in her career as well. She also participates in the Model United Nations. Let's say hello to Annie. Okay, now you've met the debaters. It's important that I read an important disclaimer that you know about these students. Before we begin, I want to remind the members of the audience that the teams have been assigned sides and topics for this debate. Their arguments should not be interpreted as endorsements of positions by the debaters or by their institutions they represent. They're here to fully present both sides of a controversial issue so that you, the voting public, can make a better informed decision on the question. Is that clear? Randomly assign the topics. They're going to give you, they'll give you the information. They leave it up to you to decide. So that's an important disclaimer to remember. Well, now it's time to do what we've all been waiting for, and it's to have this debate on this question. This House opposes the acceptance of Syrian refugees into the United States. My gosh, who could oppose that? Well, we'll see who could. I suppose, unless you were living under a rock, you know that since the Syrian war began in 2011, more than 4 million Syrians have fled the country, creating the greatest refugee crisis since World War II. Most have fled to Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, but many have risked death to reach Europe and possibly a better life in other countries as well. Unlike Syria and unlike Europe, the United States has the advantage of picking and choosing from afar. So far, we've only taken about 2,000 Syrian refugees since the war started. The Obama administration, however, has pledged to take 10,800 a year, starting in 2016. But there are others that suggest that number is too small. In fact, we have a moral obligation to take many more. So, what are our moral obligations? What are our cultural, economic, and security issues that are at hand here and must be taken into account in this important public policy question? Should we let in just 10,800, or as Secretary Kerry recently suggested 75,000, or another congressman's thought 100,000 a year would be about the right number? That's a short introduction. I'll let the debaters more fully explicate this question for you. So, without further ado, let me tell you what will happen. The debaters each will speak for 7 minutes. We have a front half and the back half. There will be a pound on the desk. Will you be pounding, Charlie?
Yes.
Yeah, Charlie will be pounding. There will be a pound on the desk, in which time no questions may be asked by the opponent. But in between that time, they're allowed to cross-examine or make statements to their opponents, which they will do, I hope, in a lively manner. The audience may participate by knocking on their desk when they agree with a point. Some audience members like to say shame when they hear a point they like or don't like. In the forum, if any of you have seen the parliamentary debates in the House of Commons, etc., you'll get a feeling for how these debates sometimes go. So, without any further delay, let's find out what's happening with this question of Syrian refugees. The chair will like to hear the leader of the government for a speech not to exceed 7 minutes in length.
Mother Teresa once said that you can do no great things, just little things with great love. We think it is honorable what the opposition side of this House wants to do, but that their messianic complex will do nothing but hurt the citizens of America and hurt everyone in the process. We go on to start off with a few definitions. First of all, we will define this House of the United States, logically, and acceptance as legally allowing in Syrian refugees through the UN High Commission for Refugees Standard Protocol and through the Immigration Act, as Professor Miller mentioned, letting in 10,800 a year. Now, we think the value for this debate is going to have to primarily be the welfare for American citizens, because a country's priority is first to take care of the people within that country. Secondarily, then, we will, in addition, look at the benefits to Syrian refugees. So what do we think the problem is, okay? We think that right now our vetting process taking in Syrian refugees costs hundreds of thousands of dollars per person, and that we can use that aid to better help Syrian refugees who are already displaced to places like Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Europe. We will go through 3 observations that will take us through the case and lead us to the final conclusion that America is not the best solution for these people. We start with observation 1, and that is that there are significant flaws in the vetting process. Although we agree that the vetting process is incredibly intensive, the major process is that it relies almost significantly on SIGINT or signal intelligence. What is this? This is all data that is obtained from cell phone tapping, from wiretapping, from satellite data, and the problem is, without being backed up by human intelligence, the only way you can evade being noticed as a terrorist is to not text about it or to not talk about it on the phone. Now, this is a significant problem, and Asha Rangappa agreed with us, and he is currently the Associate Dean at the Yale Law School and a former FBI Special Agent. He stated that SIGINT has gone by far and away the major source of intelligence, and until human catches up, we will be open to more attacks like those in Paris. We see examples of their flaws in the vetting process, where 15 Iraqi refugees have been let in, where the vetting process actually failed. Even if you don't want to buy that the SIGINT is a problem, we see that there are always government loopholes that let people in. That's a problem. The more people we let in, the more of those potential threats we have. Observation 2. American Islamophobia is at an all-time high. We saw that YouGov found in 2015 that 55% of Americans have an unfavorable view of Islam, and Gallup poll found in 2015 that 48% of Muslims have already experienced religious discrimination in this country. This is reflected in our legislation, where we found that 34 out of 50 U.S. governors have protested the acceptance of refugees, and a 2016 NBC poll found that 56% of Americans disapproved of allowing more refugees in. Yet at the same time, as Professor Miller already astutely mentioned, John Kerry wants to bring in 75,000 this year and 100,000 next year. This does not reflect the will of the people, and this has significant impacts on them once they're in this country, before I go to observation 3.
Yeah, isn't that Islamophobia? Because, like, we don't have an idea of what the other is, that we hear about these news reports and media reports of what happens afar, but we would do much better to decrease that if we actually met these people firsthand.
No, see, because that's not the issue. This isn't going to be an integration like they want you to think. And that's observation 3, that refugees are never evenly discriminated, and this leads to problems. When these people come into the country, they are looked down upon by members of the society. As I stated, 48% of Muslims have already experienced religious discrimination. This forces them to self-ghettoize because they are so ostracized from society, and oftentimes they are brought into places in the Midwest where they have the highest degree of homogeny, where they have the least diversity. And this is why we've actually seen that Minnesota, which was the largest place of Somali refugees being distributed there, is now the largest recruiter for ISIS members in the United States. When they come to the United States, they are not welcome. This forces them to stick together. They are ostracized from society, and what this breeds is anti-U.S. sentiment. We think this leads us to a threat of national security. And don't let them come up here and tell you that because we've not had a terrorist attack like we saw in Paris, that we are safe. We are safe because our FBI is doing their job, but we are still constantly at risk. For example, we've seen in the last 18 months, 66 people were arrested on acts of conspiracy to commit acts of terror. Many of those were refugees from Somalia, from Iraq, and from Syria. My partner will give you more specific examples, but we see that we are constantly at risk. The second impact that we are going to talk to you about from that observation is that we have the rise of anti-free speech movements in the United States. Now, what's the background for this? We see that governments feel an obligation to help all the people living in their country so that they feel safe and accepted. However, when refugees come to this country, when they face the vitriol spewed at them by people who didn't want them here in the first place, the government tries to step in and protect them. Now, you may think this is outrageous and that no one really wants to limit rights, but we see from Joe's introduction alone that they'd rather put the feelings above others above your own rights, okay? So what you see is that this is a significant problem, and not just by looking at what has happened here, but looking at what's happened throughout Europe as we've let in hundreds of thousands of refugees. Okay, we see that Die Welt has reported in June of 2015 that at a public school in an area in Germany near refugee camps, a public issue was noted to all the female students, that stated that the female students should wear restrained everyday clothing because short shorts and miniskirts could lead to misunderstandings. And additionally, they were to refrain from eye contact from the refugees. And now normally you could just brush this off and say it was just a school making some ludicrous claim, but the actual local Passau politician even stated that these laws are absolutely necessary to keep safety. We think that's a problem. We think that is anti-expression. Additionally, the same news source stated in 2015 that Germany has actually stated, Angela Merkel stated, that German citizens could have their children taken away from them for tweeting xenophobic tweets because they justified it as the child's welfare is endangered because they're around racism. We think racism is a problem, yes. We do not believe that infringing upon people's rights is the solution to that problem. You may say this would never happen in the United States. The sad thing is we see it has already happened. At the University of Minnesota, we stated that they rejected a 9/11 remembrance because they stated it has perceived bias against Muslims. Now, we think that's a problem. What we see is that we're having the spread of the very tenets which have established this country, and that we cannot even risk having that happen in the United States. We've shown you that there is risk to national security, and overall we reached the conclusion that the United States is not the best solution for either parties. We've told you that we have both the risks of homegrown terrorism and the risk of anti-Western ideals. Well, we've shown you that there is no unique benefit for Syrian refugees to come to the United States. When they come here, they face self-ghettoization, they face ostracization from society, and the best solution is to keep them in places like Europe, like Lebanon, like Jordan, and instead of using hundreds of thousands of dollars to vet them, to either give that money to humanitarian aid, where only a fraction of it getting to them would do much more good than letting them in here. We believe the opposition side has no unique benefits, and for that reason, we strongly urge the government ballot, and we oppose the acceptance of refugees. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now hear from the leader of the opposition for a speech not to exceed 7 minutes in length.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, when 3-year-old Alan Kurdi, a toddler in red t-shirt, blue shorts, and velcro sneakers, was found dead on Kurdish shore, the world was plunged into grief, indignation, and no small amount of soul-searching. The tragedy portrayed in that image served as a wake-up call for all of us that refugees are victims of war who need protection and dignity. Therefore, today as opposition, we propose that America, as the only superpower of the world, should accept Syrian refugees as means of ending the suffering of Syrian refugees and promoting the interests of its own. So first, a few responses to the previous speaker. So one point he mentioned that because America has this xenophobia sentiment, so we should not let refugees come into America because they will suffer more. But Mr. Speaker, we believe that is exactly the rhetoric ISIS want, right? Because by stopping Syrian refugees entering the US, actually those terrorists actually fulfill their rhetoric of that there's a West against like Islamic culture, there's a clash of civilization happening here, that you are not welcome here. We all know that it's actually against the principle of America as a great melting pot. It's against America as a country with great diversity. So believe that, just as POI raised by our lower house, we believe that the solution is not to stop Syrian refugees entering the US, but rather better helping those people integrate into societies. integrating into current societies in the United States. So coming to his second point, which is the most important point in her speech, is about security, right? So let's come into to my first observation. We believe that Syrian refugees are not a threat to national security. However, turning them away is actually a threat to our national security. So what's your point?
Yes. Now, what's going to establish the ISIS narrative is not the idea that they are going to not be let into the country, but the fact that when they get here, they are ostracized, they are treated as second-class citizens. That is what gives rise to terrorism. That is why Minnesota is now the largest ISIS supporter from the Somali camp.
We believe that the problem exists that xenophobia is not only like to Syrian refugees, but also to, like, for example, black people, for example, racial minorities. You cannot say that because xenophobia exists, because people hate each other, then we drive those people who we hate away. We believe that's not the end solution to this problem, right? So coming to my first attention, firstly, we believe that Syrian refugees enter the US don't become terrorists. So the previous speaker have talked about how there's a loophole in our system, right? But looking back on the current status quo, we believe that since 1980, the US has invited in millions of refugees, including thousands from the Middle East, and none of them have been arrested on domestic terrorism charges. So secondly, we've seen that there's an anti-refugee sentiment happen after the Paris attack in San Bernardino. But we believe that actually that sentiment is misleading, because looking at all the perpetrators involved in that event, none of them are Syrian refugees. However, we've seen that citizens from France and citizens from America are actually the perpetrators of this terrorist event in the two countries. Secondly, we believe terrorists are not fools. Refugees are the most difficult way for them to enter in the US. So according to Jana Mason, senior advisor at UNHCR, she said that of all categories of persons entering the US, Syrian refugees are the single most heavily screened and vetted. We believe so actually current status quo is that Syrian refugees have to undergo a multi-stage vetting process and receive UN designation by trade officers before they're admitted. We believe that the lengthy and extensive vetting process is actually effective deterrent for anyone that is potential terrorist. Therefore, comparing to other channels of entering US, for example, students or tourist visa, which is used by 911 jihadists, we believe that refugee status is the single most difficult way to enter US for those terrorists. Hence, the conclusion of my first observation is that if Syrian refugees is a threat to national security, then every one of us sitting here in this hall, namely US citizens and tourists or exchange students like me, are more likely to be potential terrorists rather than Syrian refugees. Because actually we are less censored, we don't have this kind of strict vetting process coming when we are entering the United States of America. So, but what is the real threat of refugee crisis? We will stop accepting them, right? Firstly, we believe that the real danger of migration lies in destabilizing effect of fragile states and in the violent backlash it provokes. The previous speaker mentioned that we can help the situation in Lebanon, we can help the situation in Turkey for them to receive Syrian refugees. But we believe that those countries, because they're fragile states, so for example, Lebanon has 44.8 million people and 1 million refugees that it can afford, and the number of refugees are still increasing. We believe that for those fragile states, social backlash is more likely to happen as the labor markets and social resources are more limited in those countries compared to developed countries like US. We believe that if refugees are stuck in those countries and live in desperation, the instability occurs in those countries will eventually expand the current conflicts. And because those countries like Lebanon, like Turkey, are actually important allies of US in Middle East, they have a strategic position to us. So believe that when that conflicts occur in those countries, US will pay more. US will have to solve more problems than simply accepting Syrian refugees into our country's status quo. Secondly, we believe that Syrian refugees are actually potential allies of US in fighting against ISIS and dealing with the hated Syrian dictator Bashar Assad. So we believe that actually turning them away will make us less safe in the current status quo. So coming to my benefits of accepting Syrian refugees. Before I move on, what's your point?
Yes. Now, we don't actually solve the issue. It would be nice to say we'll ease the pain that Lebanon and Turkey feel, but the issue is we're taking in only 10,800. That is not enough to actually make any difference in stabilizing those countries.
We believe that after US taking action, actually other countries also taking action, taking refugees into their own land. We believe that US need to lead this process. We've seen that after European countries, some of them open their borders. We've seen that open their borders. Other countries also take actions to help Syrian refugees. We believe that US should be the start of this kind of humanitarian process of receiving Syrian refugees into their society. So coming to my last point about how actually receiving Syrian refugees will receive an important ally fight against ISIS. So first I'm going to explain the the relationship among Syrian refugees, ISIS, and Bashar al-Assad. So ISIS and Bashar al-Assad are fighting against each other, while Syrian refugees are actually fleeing from a dictatorship from Assad, and especially the Muslim refugees are also persecuted by ISIS as they are traitor to the radical Islamic cause. So we've seen that Kurds and Christian refugees see ISIS as their main foe. Therefore, we believe that turning away the refugees will only drive them back into the hands of those, for example, ISIS, for example, Bashar al-Assad, because that will be the power that will provide them shelter, provide them with kind of safety. So looking back into history, looking back to Cold War, we use refugee resettlement to gain foreign assets, to gain spies, allies, and spokesmen to refute our enemies' propaganda. We believe the same thing can happen here. If America receiving Syrian refugees into their own country, we will have more intelligence sources to fight against ISIS, to fight against the dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad. So we believe that Americans receiving Syrian refugees can actually not only help Syrian refugees out of danger, but also help our country make it great again. And that's all. Thank you.
Chair will now hear the deputy member. Not to exceed 7 minutes in length.
Ladies and gentlemen, before we go on, I'd just like to point out, right, that taking in 10,000 refugees isn't going to solve the Syrian conflict to the extent that they're pointing out. It's not going to suddenly make these fragile states less fragile. It's not going to suddenly stop the Syrian refugee conflict. It's not going to stop making people want to get into boats and go to Europe anyway, right? That's not what it's doing. So what they have to prove on their side, and this is their burden on a side opposition, is they have to prove unique benefit to bringing 10,000 refugees into the U.S., right? The U.S. has to have something that all these other countries don't, or it has to provide some benefit that all these other countries don't, especially given the harms that my partner showed to you and that I'm going to show to you now. Now, she came up here and said that we're actually going to be playing into ISIS narrative. Actually, this isn't true. ISIS is going to have a vested interest in coming in as Syrian refugees, not just as like student visas or something, because they want to create trouble, because they want to like reinforce this xenophobic and Islamophobic sentiment in the West, because they want to villainize the West and claim that it's anti-Muslim, and like they're basically going to want to make it worse, right? Second, she said that there's going to be like social backlash, and like we said, it's going to be backlash in the U.S. too. It's just going to reinforce the harmful image. So what we see on their side is they're not actually solving for any of the harms that they're bringing about. Also, it doesn't cause, like we're going to show you, it's actually going to be more harmful to bring them within the U.S. Now, moving on to my proper argument, right? I'm going to show you the cultural isolation and why this leads to a threat to the U.S. because of like the violence in communities and because of the threat of radicalization. Now, first of all, like my partner showed to you, there's ghettoization in the Somali and American community. Shows that these refugees tend to get isolated once they come into the West, right? They tend to be isolated from the rest of society just simply culturally. This is because of conflict in values, right? Because we see that just rejecting ISIS or rejecting extreme propaganda is not the same as accepting liberal democracy. Because just because you reject that doesn't mean you suddenly are okay with equality of women, are okay with having like a woman as a boss, are okay with members of the LGBTQ community, right? And this isolation is made even worse because of the vitriol and like the bad, the Islamophobia and xenophobia that we see in the West already. That's already prevalent, right? So this conflict, like we see in Germany, there were arsonists who set fire to refugee buildings or like buildings that were supposed to house refugees. We see physical attacks on the refugees in these places. We see obscenities shouted at them. So all these things together don't really make for a very hospitable environment once they come here. Now, why is this a bad thing? Because the more culturally isolated you get, the more it leads to like this, the more it makes you susceptible to radicalization and makes you angrier, so that there tends to be violence in communities. Now, we see like this conflict of culture, seen things like the New Year's Eve rapes in Germany or the sexual assaults. We see attacks on Yazidis, Christians, people perceived as gay in these resettlement camps. We see men not allowing their wives to go unaccompanied into those cultural orientation classes. So what we see here basically is that they're not able to assimilate or adapt to the same extent that side opposition would have you believe. Now, why is this a bad thing? Because this disenfranchisement in extreme situations makes them more susceptible to radicalization. Like we said, it's not necessarily that the people who are coming in are going to be terrorists, it's more that the second generation or people who just similarly feel disenfranchised, people in the future the children of the refugees are going to like not feel welcome in the West, which is going to lead to this feeling of resentment, which in extreme situations makes them susceptible to radicalization. For example, with Somalian Americans, right? In 2014 alone, 60 young men and women left Minnesota to join terrorist organizations such as ISIS and Al-Shabaab, right? Now we see that there are instances of sending money back to these terrorist organizations. We see that the FBI is now monitoring the community because of this disenfranchisement and this isolation they feel from the rest of the West. And we believe inherently this is also a threat to the community and to the social fabric of the United States, which they haven't addressed from their side. Second, we see the second harm to the United States is the rise of fascist and like radical conservative parties. What we see is that, like my partner said to you, like recent polls say that 65% of Americans are opposed to taking in Syrian refugees. If you bring these refugees into a country that doesn't really want it, we see already that this isn't the most hospitable situation anyway, right? The society is already polarized as it is. We see people like Donald Trump and Ted Cruz rising in the polls despite airing xenophobic views. And what we see in Europe is the reaction to this hasn't been very good, right? In response to these refugees, European nations are suddenly seeing a surge in radical right and fascist parties because they espouse an anti-immigrant stance. They're capitalizing on this fear and resentment they have of refugees. For example, in France, you see the Front National, Finland's Finn party for only true Finns, Denmark, the Danish People's Party, even Germany, which is like, because rightly so, pretty scared of ultra-conservative parties, now has such parties rising again. And we see in these situations that refugees are scapegoated. Political parties tend to capitalize on these sentiments to consolidate their own power, and we don't think, in fact, they propagate the xenophobia and Islamophobia because they now have a vested interest in furthering this, and we believe this is just bad for the US because we don't want similar things to happen in the US with these ultra-conservative or radical conservative parties spreading xenophobia and hate.
See, the rise of the fascist parties in Europe was a result of a lot of refugees coming in at one go, right? The fact that they weren't able to, in a way, think about how these refugees would behave. However, in the United States, we'll see a different situation where a limited number of refugees will come in at one point of time. As a result, people will be able to better understand that.
So, like we said, right, if you bring them into a country that doesn't really want them, this is what's going to happen. They're not assimilating to the same extent that you want them to. So this isn't, they don't really solve for these harms. Now, I'm going to show you, like, basically on their side, the only benefit that they've brought that is unique to the United States is the moral argument, right? That basically the United States has a moral responsibility to these people. And I'm going to show you financially why this isn't really true. We on our side can help more people over there than bring them into the United States. So, like, let's look at the cost to the US, right? The federal government says 91% of all Middle Eastern refugees are on food stamps. Somalian Americans, like, we're looking at them as an example for this. 34% of them are on food assistance, 98% of them are on cash assistance. Sorry, 98% of them are on food assistance and 34% on cash. Now, the people who are coming here, they're not going to places like New Jersey. They're not going to these ultra-liberal communities that are willing to accept them completely, right? They're going to smaller communities with lower costs of living, where people already have need for government facilities, and they already have like high unemployment. The schools are already overwhelmed. In these situations, if you send these refugees, it's just not very. They're not going to have the quality of life that they promise you, right? Also, it's not going to lead to foster a very hospitable sentiment, or it's going to lead to more resentment and fear. Now, why is this a bad thing? Now, compare this against if we help to resettle them somewhere near to home, right? The Center for Immigration Studies executive director said that it costs 12 times as much to resettle them over here rather than resettling them over there. So over here, it'll cost like $64,000. Over there, it's going to be $5,300. So now we see that on our side, we can actually help 12 times as many over there rather than over here, right? So if we can help more people over there without all the harms that we're showing you, then we believe that you have to vote on our side because we present the most benefits with the least amount of harms and help the most people, and so I urge you to vote this side.
LGBT group. It's only in last year that the Supreme Court passed a law of saying that it's legalized marriage for LGBT group. It's only in 1920s that you have universal suffrage to grant women to vote. And then it's very hypocrite suddenly for you to say that just because you become very, very liberal now, and then suddenly people in Middle East, people who are very conservative, are different kinds of people that you will never integrate with them, you will never talk with them, right? We think it's very unfair for you to accuse them just because it's cultural issues, and it's very not humanitarian for you to say that as well. Because, in fact, not many refugees actually feel that kind of grievances when they enter into a foreign country, right? Because it's not fact that we can see refugees, when they enter into Sweden, they even sound like sing national anthems on the bus because they're very grateful that the country take them, grant them the home that is being long lost. That's why we think the United States should do it. And all they said that people are losing their hopes and they feel like a ghettoization or all these grievances that might go through. We say, okay, probably there are something that's going through, but still, you can help them with it, right? Well, I already see like throughout all these days, I saw all kinds of English as second language speaking like centers, or this you offer help to foreigners. We think it's very friendly, it's very good, and you can also offer cultural courses for all these people who just newly arrived in your country to better help them integrate. In terms of just like you say that we reject them based on the very simple fact that we are different. And also the other thing, you talk about xenophobia, Islamophobia, but we cannot see any way to deal with it just because you do not want to get in touch with them. We think more integration will only happen when you have, let's say, more exposure to different kinds of group and different culture. And all these far-right fascisms in Europe, right? We think, okay, it is bad, but still, it's a free market of ideas that Europeans cherish a lot. And that's why it actually pushes more moderate people to go to vote, to go to support liberalism. And with more discussion happen, more people will actually switch to the side where they uphold liberalism or uphold the people's universal rights. Yes.
Yes, I'm sure they will sing the national anthems on the bus here, but when they come to the ghettos, when 48% of them will experience religious discrimination, that is where we see the problem. That is where we see the stop of any Western idealism.
Yeah, but still, think of what they have experienced in Syria, right? They are running for their own lives. That's why it's actually not very likely for them to just say that, okay, I live in ghetto, okay, probably I didn't grant the chances that white men have in this country. Then I suddenly become, resort to the terrorism that I spent all the 2 years or even 18 months to go through the vetting systems that just to become a terrorist in this country. We just think it's not likely. And they also say that, okay, number is minute, right? We only have 10,000 or even 5,000 whatsoever, but still it's not mutually exclusive. You can have bombing, you can have all this kind of humanitarian aid in Middle East, and at the same time, you can accept refugees. And here I come to my arguments. First argument, we think it will lead to radicalization of refugees in Middle East. Just to extend my partner's points in terms of Islamic phobia and all this ideology of ISIS, right? Because they have this self-claimed caliphate, it's obligatory for all Muslims to give the oath of allegiance and support al-Baghdadi. So it's actually a call, and they hate individuals who flee Syria for Europe, for United States, because it actually undermines ISIS' message that it's a self-styled caliphate, it's a refuge for Muslims in the world, and they rely on this ideology heavily, right? So by helping ISIS is principally help United States itself, because when you reject refugees, you actually prove ISIS' argument that the West do not want to assist Syrian Muslims, and it's actually what ISIS really want, because then these men who are on the ground, who have no help to turn to, their only salvation lies in ISIS. And we can see all this intensified warfare happening in Syria right now, and it's actually become a coercive choice for people to join ISIS on the ground, and also strengthen the narrative that ISIS is legit, ISIS is justified. That's why when people see the number of people joining ISIS going up and up, and they see towns and cities being taken by ISIS, that's a moment that more people might be encouraged to be radicalized, and that's a moment that the United States do not want to see, right? My second argument is actually demonize the Muslim community as a whole, because you have this seemingly very hardcore diplomacy in terms of saying that we're afraid of the backlash, so we do not want to take in any Syrian refugees at all. That actually empowers the narrative that Sunni Muslims or Muslims in general, they have potential to resort to terrorism when it comes to danger, when it comes to grievances. And it empowers the narrative that they are dangerous to our Western society. regardless of the fact that most terrorism acts conducted in the United States are actually conducted by white men, by some like racism or domestic violence or whatsoever. So it's actually not true that these Muslims are actually will be resort to terrorism. And the root cause of terrorism is even not related to religion, but it's related to grievances, related to people who are suffering, have no way to voice out their opinions. That's why when you send this hostile signal to all Muslims in Middle East, at this time, when United States, when U.S.-led coalition need Muslims fighters to fight against ISIS more than ever, right? It's actually not helpful even for your policies in Middle East, because most people fight on the ground against ISIS are also Muslims, because they think it's kind of misrepresentation. It's unfair for them. That's why. Even if, let's say, we have a very minute number, we only have 10,000 or even 5,000 Muslims coming into, Syrian refugees coming to this country, it's actually symbolic meaning that we want to let you in. At least we want to face our xenophobia. We want to deal with it. And for those fighters who are fighting with us on the ground, we can guarantee that if a man is fighting, your wife will be accepted in this country, and you will be fighting for our country, for our side. And we think it's justified at the end of the day, right? So my third argument is that it's actually alt-right racism that they are proposing, because they discriminate people based on their nationality, discriminate people based on their beliefs and ethnic. And I think it's very dangerous for United States to resort to this kind of policies, because when it's resort to this nationality thing, it's very easy to you to fan fears among people, and when it's fear controls people, like Donald Trump, right, the politicians, it actually will pass policies without full scrutiny, and that's why many policies, biased policies, pass when after 9/11 in Middle East, and we regret some of them, and we do not want it to happen nowadays in terms of this one. So based on all this, we're very proud to propose.
Thank you very much. Now for the bottom half debate.
Ladies and gentlemen, today when we mentioned about U.S., we believe that U.S. is actually in a leading role in both environment part or technology innovation, or also solving the problem like poverty part. So we think Americans should be responsible for some problem, and we should do something to help refugees, but not by today's motion, not by simple acceptance to those refugees. We think by simple acceptance of these refugees cannot solve the root problem, which should be both protect the refugees in the Middle East area, but also to protect U.S. local citizens. So today we think that once the root problem, that domestic conflicts in the Syria do not solve, there will be more refugees coming to seek for help, not only in the U.S., but also seek for help in other areas like in EU and in China or other many parts. So so today we should focus more on something very tangible parts. So the whole case set by the opposition side is more based on an ideal way that we can solve some problem in a culture level, but we do not think so. Our lower house will try to bring you something realistic, which will cause more conflict between the refugees and U.S. local citizens. And first, several rebuttals. First, you mentioned about that there will be some radicalization, but we think after we make acceptance for these refugees, it will cause these refugees more likely to be radical in this way, and we'll mention that in my argument part. And second, we think that we will not try to do nothing to help those refugees. We will try to provide protection in their own country, not by acceptance to the United States. And third, and second argument is about that you think refugees can actually be an alliance with U.S., but we do not think so. We think after these refugees come entering into the United States, we'll get more conflict with each other. And that's to move to that why we think it is more easily for refugees to become radical after they get this acceptance. So first argument, we're trying to bring you something very tangible. First, for American citizens, since 9/11, we know that for the whole upper house, I mentioned that xenophobia actually happens previous in the citizens' life. And according to the status quo, that actually American citizens are xenophobia to what happened, and also they are more strict interest policies about the people who are going to America. And the recently accident happening in Paris attack will increase U.S. citizens more concerned. They're more terrified about. They get more fear about the terrorist attack. So today, you mean think that because it is just because we do not know them well, we have some misunderstanding them. So we should accept them to know that they are not that radical. But it is not true. We know it is not easy for men to change their mind in a very short time. It is people because today we just simply accept those refugees. We did not provide them a buffer zone to give them a buffer time that these people are actually friendly. You just simply all of a sudden you just pull this 65,000 refugees into this to the United States. It is not likely to happen for them to accept those refugees. And what we like to say is about the refugees' identity actually have some potential danger to the United States. Even if only one case is happening, that we do not know how huge consequences it will cause. Just like in the 911 case, even just one case happening, that it will cause irreversible consequences for this whole country. Yes.
Folks, the United States has accepted over 100,000 Iraqi refugees from a similarly destabilized country, and we don't see any of the harms that they claim are going to happen. They're just claims, and that's all they are.
We still want to mention about the possibility part. Once one case is happening, that it will cause irreversible consequences, and there will be even more conflicts in my next argument. So B, ever since refugees actually come to the United States, they have their basic skills, and even some are in the middle class in their own country. So after they get accepted in the United States, they will not only using the local resources, they will compete with the local citizens about job hunting. In this year February, actually the United States have controlled the unemployment rate under 5%. So once they have come in there, actually for the American lower classes, who are doing the minute job, they actually will get competed with refugees. With those refugees, which will cause the local citizens not that satisfied with this situation. So for refugees part, there will also three reasons for them to get conflict with the local citizens. A, first is about the religion problem, like the Islamic versus Christianity problem. They got different culture about this part, and we think it is not very. You need to give them more time to get adapted to each other, not by all of a sudden to accept to the United States. And B, because it is their first time to move in the United States, so we believe they are actually a vulnerable group, because there will be less organization and politicians will try to voice of them. And also for them, this is the refugees' first time to come to the United States, so they have less chance to voice out their rights, because the local organizations or politicians actually put more concerns about their own country's affairs, not about this group. And say, after they settle down, there are more problems like education, welfare system, or Medicaid. Should they join this kind of systems? Whether they will pay the tax for them or not. So based on all that, we think it will cause conflicts between refugees and U.S. citizens. So what we're trying to solve this problem is like, since there are 65,000 refugees are waiting in line to get rescued, and once the conflict does not go into an end, there will be more and more refugees coming out. So we believe the best solution we can give is not by simple acceptance of these refugees, but we're trying to solve this problem brutally. They're trying to build like a safe zone in Syria and get them under protection. Like we can send troops to the Syrian to protect them, and we can donate money and food trying to solve them. It is not only because we think that by simple acceptance of these refugees cannot protect refugees themselves, but it also will cause the local citizens in a more danger places. And we believe it is for the both parties good, and we'll try to do this way. And for the most efficient way is definitely not by acceptance of these refugees. And we are proud to propose this motion. Thank you.
Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. These are the words written by poet Emma Lazarus on the pedestal of our Statue of Liberty, and these words are not meant to be a marker of a past time. These are the values that we are meant to uphold today. What am I going to do in this speech? First, a little bit of historical analysis about refugees and the refugees that we have taken thus far. But before that, I'm going to get to some explicit refutation about their case before showing you why immigrants will be better for our economy, why we have a principled obligation to take these refugees, and why the United States is not Europe. All right. So first, let's do some refutation. So first I want to talk about this alternative they offer us of let's just send in food aid, right? We've heard this solution before and it doesn't work. Why does it not work? Because it gets intercepted by governments in those regions that tend to be more corrupt, that use this as a leverage to their supporters. This is what we saw, for example, with Assad in Syria already, where in towns like Madaya, he besieges them, does not give them food, yet to the towns that support him, he gives them more food, right? So we think that that leverages that. But second, and maybe most importantly, is that we can do both at the same time. We can accept Syrian refugees and also offer humanitarian aid, and that, we think, is probably the best course to go forward. First, they talk. Their first argument is about flaws in the vetting process, right? But I think we need to be clear about what the vetting process is. So let's talk about it for a moment. First of all, you have to apply through the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, at which point only 1% are recommended for relocation to the United States. Then you are sent to the State Department for a vetting process. More info is collected. You go through the National Counterterrorism Center, the FBI, the DHS, and if you are Syrian, then you go to specifically the Syria Enhanced Review through USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, right? And at this point, the process is only barely getting started. Then you interview with USCIS officials. Then you go through the biometric databases of the FBI, of the DHS, of the DOD. And then if you haven't already had a stroke going through this process already, then you have health screenings as well as cultural orientation classes. All the while, your information continues to be checked against FBI, DOD, DHS databases. Look, all of this happens before anybody even boards a plane. What do we see? We see that this has massive risk mitigation and that we can be highly selective as to who we select to make sure they're not going to be a harm to our country. They have another argument about Islamophobia rising, right, in the United States. We say actually it's down since 9/11, right? But secondly, we think that it's the Trump-esque rhetoric that opening government brings to us that is the reason that Islamophobia is rising, because people choose to stereotype rather than interact with the other, right? And secondly, like, look, I'd like to have more Syrian refugees here. Personally, I think we do pretty well in Westwood to have some good falafel stores, don't you? But so secondly, then they make this argument about self-ghettoization. We say, first of all, this isn't happening, and it's a lot worse in Europe. It's a lot worse in the refugee camps, that this is the best place for refugees to be. And we have to make a distinction, right? Because when they talk about like people being recruited toward ISIS, many of these are actually native-born Americans. But secondly, there's a distinction because refugees are specifically fleeing ISIS. If they wanted to support ISIS, they would have joined them when they were in Syria. They make this free speech argument. I say that the First Amendment, which is held sacred in this country, protects against that. When we protect things like people holding signs saying bong hits for Jesus, and also when the burning of the American flag is protected under free speech, we don't think that anybody's free speech rights are going to be limited. Now, let's get to some constructive argumentation. Yeah, what's up?
Yes. Now, don't let them convince you of this thing where that no other refugees are going to cause problems. Okay, we've seen consistent examples where since 2014 there have been 15 Iraqi refugees who have been arrested for terror charges. In this year alone, one from Houston, one from Sacramento, were arrested on terror charges.
So yeah, so the 15 Iraqi refugees arrested for terror charges isn't true, right? We've taken over 100,000 Iraqi refugees. 3 have been arrested on terror-related charges. 2 of them for aiding terrorists abroad that didn't have anything to do in this country. And in all of those cases, no harm was done to any American. And they will be unable to show throughout this entire debate how any refugee has ever harmed an American, right? And this is what we think we should be looking to, is the analysis of what's happening here, not what's happening in Europe, because we are different for a number of ways. And if I have time, I'll get to that later. But first, constructive argumentation, right? So after the end of the Vietnam War, the United States took in over 125,000 Vietnamese refugees, over 1 million Cubans, right? What were people saying? People in this country were saying that these are going to be communist agitators, that they will not be able to integrate, that they are not skilled enough to be able to compete in our labor force. None of these things came true. And we think it's time that we realize that, and in fact that they've integrated quite nicely. There's been a study done about the impact of Cuban refugees into the small city of Miami in Florida, and what they realized was that there was actually no detriment to the wages or the ability of native-born Americans to be employed there. But firstly, right, so here's my principled argumentation of why we should take them. The Pottery Barn Rule, right? This was coined by Secretary of Defense Colin Powell, who was responsible for the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, right? The Pottery Barn Rule says, you break it, you own it. This means that if you have some responsibility in a conflict abroad, that you should also own some of that responsibility, and we think that taking Syrian refugees does that. And we don't have to agree which president destabilized the region, right? Was it George Bush for actually invading those two countries with over 100,000 troops on the ground? Or was it Barack Obama for prematurely taking them out and also funding Syrian rebels and refusing to take out Assad? But we can agree that the United States has had some role in continuing the destabilization of that region, so we should accept the refugees, right? And so that means we have to, it fulfills our nation's obligations, upholds our values of freedom and liberty. Let's talk about economic long-term benefits, right? So what do we see? We see that like immigrants to this country are inherently entrepreneurial, but refugees are even more. According to the Cato Institute, we find that refugees are more likely than immigrants to learn the language and get employed into the labor force, and that also their spouses are also willing to do that at a far greater rate. Why? Because immigrants believe that if it doesn't work out, they can always go back to their own country. With refugees, this is not the case. With refugees, they know they cannot go back to their own country, so they have to integrate into our economy. And we've seen this happen with Vietnamese, with Cubans, with Soviet Jews, with Iraqi refugees as well. All the examples that exist today are on the side of the opposition. All the examples that they claim exist in Europe, first of all, that's Europe, right? And we know we're different for a number of reasons. We're not taking as many, we're not as geographically close. What have I shown you in this speech? First, that immigrants are going to be a benefit to our economy, right? But also to our culture. Second, that on principle we should take in Syrian refugees because we've contributed to them having to flee their homes. And finally, I've shown a little bit why we are not Europe, and why that their arguments don't stand when we compare them to what is going on in the current day.
and terrorists that are accumulating increasingly in Middle East countries. We can see there are the number of refugees leaving their countries are increasing rapidly. The numbers are increasing so rapidly that even the European countries have already taken some measures in order to take in more refugees, but they still not help. The crises are still here, and the crises are even worse. In that kind, we can see that since the number increases so rapidly, and we can know that taking restricted number of refugees is far from solving the problem. As my partner have already illustrated to you, that the root problem is never just taking in restricted number of refugees. The problem is how actually can we just bring in the peace and stabilization of in this kind of regions, rather than just taking restricted refugees. Even if the outside just failed to tell us how they just exactly plan to take in refugees, and how they just tell us the exact number that they're going to take in refugees. Are you going to take in all the refugees in the world from Syria, or are you just taking the restricted number of refugees? If you just want to take in some restricted number of refugees, and in order to make money or to make them just create wealth in the United States, in the national development, and what about the rest of the refugees? And you just use them as the tools in order to make money, rather than to just to help them in a humanitarian sense. And also as my partner, I want to reiterate my partner's point. That is, what we want to do as the United States, the leading role in the international community, is to help those refugees in order to solve the root problem. What caused them to be the refugees is to solve the problem and bring peace to their regions, and to give them homes in their regions, rather than just to taking some refugees and restrict refugees and using them as tools in order to make money. And here I would like to give some rebuttals to the upside. The first, as they say that bringing more refugees will better help Syrian refugees to be integrated in the United States. And according to their logic, they just want to use it as a way in order to educate citizens and to engage in the coexistence with other nations that they even fear. But I want to say that they just deliberately underestimate the problem. The problem is not actually the small difference between the cultures or some religions. The problem is so huge that even causes conflicts between our people and the refugees, because the United States is not ready actually to taking refugees. We can see, as my partner have already illustrated to you, we have already events in 911, we have the events in Paris. We know that actually the United States, the citizens are not actually so welcome the refugees. As we can see in the statistical, there are already 31 states that are not welcome those refugees. In that case, how can you guarantee that refugees, when the refugees are taken in, they will actually absolutely cause peace in the United States? And also, since the refugees are taken in, the very possible discrimination caused by the U.S. citizens will actually cause more conflicts rather than the peaceful integration for these refugees. And also, I would like to say that for those refugees, they are even, as being brought up by my upper house, that they have even bring with this suspicion whether they are pretending terrorists that will actually threaten the health or lives of our U.S. citizens. And actually, in that case, do you think that really taking refugees will be the best resolution in that case? Or we just try to place more of our focus to solve the root problems? And my second rebuttal to the previous speaker, as they have mentioned that they want to take in refugees since the refugees will be bad conducive to the U.S. economy, because they will be joining the liberal forces or create wealth. But actually, as what I want to remind you is that the outside never tell us the exact plan as to the number and the plan to taking all the refugees. And also, if I want to ask if you would like to take all the refugees, and actually we can see taking all refugees in our society is not possible, because as we can see the tangible harm to our U.S. economy to bring a large number of refugees. And if you do not want to take all the refugees, what about you just want to take some of the refugees? And what the standards if you want to select the refugees? In most of the cases, you will choose those wealthy, those who are rich, those who are capable in order to bring much wealthy to our society. But in that case, what about the rest of the refugees? They are much more poorer. They are just lack skills, they are lack skills in order to create wealth. In that way, you're just put their lives in a much more miserable way. And also, you will cause conflicts even in the refugees groups. And here I would like to give the only clash in today's debate. That is whether taking refugees is conducive to all involved parties. The stakeholder will be actually firstly the U.S. citizens, secondly the Syrian refugees, and thirdly Syria itself. For U.S. citizens, actually, as brought up by our side, they have already told you the xenophobia caused by the events happened before the 911 and also the attacks in Paris. And since they have the United States have already been attacked by terrorists, they just fear that those terrorists will be hidden around them. Since that, the U.S. citizens just believes that their lives are in danger and living places are even threatened by those people coming from a side. And they just fear, whether consciously or even unconsciously, in the people's heart towards those people coming from a side. Apart from this, they are we can see that from the sixth poll, the United States, the people in the United States are actually not so welcome those refugees. And apart from that, the problem to be faced is whether those refugees will be actually taking part in our Medicare, Medicaid, welfare system as the United States. If you do, that will actually just raise much more antagonism from our U.S. citizens, because those kind of things, welfare system, are actually brought up by our taxes. But for these U.S. Syrian refugees, they actually do not pay taxes, but they just will enjoy the same privilege as the U.S. citizens. And if you do not just make them join the Medicare or the welfare system, that will be actually the inequality between U.S. citizens and those refugees. And these refugees will be much more labeled out and much more discriminated, because they will not enjoy the same rights as the U.S. citizens. And just think about what will they do just after they, and in that way, they will cause much more just antagonism between the U.S. U.S. citizens and also the Syrian refugees. In that way, we will see much more conflicts in the future. How we will see that through this way, the United citizens will actually get much more educated in order to be integrated with other citizens. In that way, we are very proud to oppose. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we'll hear finally from the opposition whip to close the debate down. The final speech of the afternoon.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to first thank you all for coming here and watching this debate. It's been an extremely long debate with a lot of information being provided to all of you, and I can see that enthusiastic banging on the table. Thank you very much for being here. But before I move on to my speech and giving you these three issues that are key in this debate, let me first clarify something, right? The point of this debate is to not solve the root cause that's been troubling the region right now. It's not to solve the Syrian conflict in any way or to show why that our side needs to solve that problem. The main point of this debate is to show whether or not we are supposed to take in these Syrian refugees, is to show that whether or not we'll be able to save their lives and benefit the United States at the same time, and show that this does not harm the United States in any way, right? That the side closing has placed this false burden of us. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, moreover, ladies and gentlemen, we have to see that these Syrian refugees have made that perilous journey through the Mediterranean Sea in order to get to Europe, in order to get liberated, not only from the oppressive regime of Bashar al-Assad, but also from the ISIS regime themselves. We have to account the fact that these Syrian refugees are fleeing the very people that we are fighting, and as the United States government, we believe that we need to help these people, not only as our duty, but also in order to show our solidarity with the people in that region. Now, three issues that I'll be presenting to you today. The first issue is can the US really be compared to Europe? Like, can our situation be really analogous to what's happening in Europe? Second, does the US have the moral responsibility towards these Syrian refugees? And third, what would the US society look once we take in these Syrian refugees? Moving on to my first point, my first issue. Can the US be really compared to Europe? Right now, on both sides of the government side, on opening and closing, we see that they paint this picture of refugees, of what they did in Europe, right? The fact that they created some problems in that region. They say that the similar things are going to happen in the United States itself, right? But they don't paint out the true picture of what exactly is happening in Europe. Europe is facing a Syrian refugee crisis where hundreds and thousands of people are coming in and coming in their borders at one point of time, right? Whereas in the United States, we see that we are not going to face the similar problem that they are facing. We have the ability to choose the people. We have the ability to take a lesser number of people at the same time, right? Now, the opening opposition talks to you about our vetting process, about how it's that we have certain places, certain measures in place, right? But my partner brings out to you the extensive list of how exactly these Syrian refugees will be vetted in the first place, right? Given the fact that they have to go through certain screening tests, through a certain consultation, through certain cultural lessons, we see that this idea of them not integrating within the U.S. society will be considerably mitigated, right? We see that he points out to you the fact that we've taken in 100,000 Iraqi refugees, that they have not created any sort of problem that we see in Europe today, right? Given the cultural similarity between Syria and Iraq, we see that that's not going to happen within the United States, right? We can be rest assured that given the measures we have in place, this is not going to take place in the United States itself, right? Europe is a much more different scenario because they are not able to control the number of Syrian refugees that enter their border. They don't have that infrastructure in place. They don't have the means in order to, control million refugees at one point of time. But before I move on to my second issue, yes.
Yes, now they keep talking about how extensive the vetting process is, but they haven't been able to clash with the reason that the databases you go through the vetting process are flawed. They rely significantly on electronic information and not human intelligence. And moreover, just because we've not had flaws, it's because our justice system is doing the right thing.
My partner talks to you about how the United Nations is involved in that vetting process, right? Although the US uses signal intelligence, we also get this intelligence from the United Nations themselves, right? And that's the form of human intelligence that we have access to, right? We know how these Syrian refugees would be, right? The fact that the vetting process takes over 2 years and allows that only after that can the refugees come in, we see that we have this extensive process. We will be able to mitigate anticipate any sort of risk that will come in the United States, right? Europe does not have the similar processes that the United States does. That's the reason why they are facing these problems. Now, second issue is, does the United States have the moral responsibility for helping these refugees, right? Now, they on-site government say that the United States has the first moral responsibility to the people, and that we should not consider the Syrian refugees at all, right? Where on-site opposition, we say that yes, we are, we say that we do want the citizens to be safe, right? But that's why, in the first place, we have these vetting processes in place, right? The government is doing its duty in order to protect the citizens in the first place, right? But secondly, why do we have the responsibility of helping these Syrian refugees in the first place, right? My partner talks to you about this idea of the pottery barn rule, that when you break it, you buy that problem, right? Because we went into this into the region in Iraq, and we created this destabilizing force that led to the rise of ISIS, right? As a result, what we see that even Syria was engulfed as a result of that, and because of this, the Syrian refugees are pouring into Europe, and they want, in a way, want a safe haven where they can improve their lives, right? Based on this principle of the pottery barn, we see that the US actually has the moral responsibility to help these people in order to ensure that, their lives are ameliorated, they have the opportunity to grow themselves, right? So we see that the US actually has a moral responsibility in helping them. And secondly, it's just the basic humanitarian perspective that we need to take into account in this place, right? The fact that these Syrian refugees are dying, making this perilous journey through these harsh winters, we see that they need to be given a chance in order to improve their lives, right? Given the fact that these people actually have the entrepreneurial abilities in order to help the US, we see that they will actually be beneficial for the US in some way, right? And this brings me to my third key issue, and the last issue is, what would the US society look like in the long term, right? Now, the opening government tells you that these refugees would be ostracized, would be, ghettoized, and they would not be able to integrate within the US society, right? But we say on side opposition that that's not entirely true, right? My partner brings out to you the inherent nature of entrepreneurship within these people, right? He talks to you about how these people will be challenged themselves, and they will be motivated in order to improve their lives, and in order to learn the culture of the United States, to ensure that their lives are improved, that their financial standing is improved, right? We say that the refugees would not take up any jobs of the citizens themselves. They inherently would want to create their own jobs, or take up jobs that belong to other immigrants for that matter, and as a result, we see there will be no as such impacts on the US citizens themselves. And moreover, we see that although we have short-term economic impacts of paying welfare benefits for these refugees, in the long term we see that they will be contributing through their taxes, through the fact that they create jobs for other people, right? We see these economic benefits in the long term, which will be beneficial for the United States. And however, given the fact that the aid is, we are providing this aid in a very destabilized region, we think that that's not going to be helpful at all. It's actually going to create more economic harms for the US as opposed to the economic benefits we tell you. And for all these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, we see that we should allow these Syrian refugees to come in the United States, because not only is it our moral responsibility, but it's also the right thing to do.
Thank you very much. Will you join me in giving all 8 debaters a nice round of applause for their recent debate. Now we're very pleased, we'll have an afterword by Professor von Blum, who I will briefly introduce. Those of you know him, he's a COMM Studies professor, a passionate teacher, written extensively on criticism and art. Paul Robinson, winner of many distinguished teaching awards. I think the greatest tribute to Paul von Blum is you walk down the COMM Studies office aisles, and you'll see students outside lined his doors, waiting to speak to him, waiting to talk to him, and to be consulted with him. And he's very graciously agreed to say a few words about this conflict today. Paul.
Thank you. I'm sorry I missed much of the debate. We have one of these inevitable time conflicts. I have my student papers due in 2 weeks. And I had a line of students who needed the consultation. They didn't really need consultation, they just needed me to pat them on the head and say that their papers are proceeding very nicely. Anyway, a couple of very brief comments. I will, in fact, be brief. I want to thank all of you for participating in this, and I want to thank the Communication Studies Department for sponsoring this, and I want to thank Tom Miller for extraordinary work in guiding the debate team for so many years. A couple of general observations about this. This kind of enterprise is very important. It promotes debate, which is what we need a lot more of instead of screaming at each other. I think some of you may have watched the recent television spectacles of people pretending to be debating and in fact doing something very, very different. Even though I was not here for the past hour, I assume that nobody screamed at each other and said that each of you was a liar. I assume that nobody during today's presentation threatened to sue one another. So I assume that all of this was done at a much higher level of discourse. And I think we, in fact, need to have much, much more of this kind of reasoned debate. That's why we do debate, so that we can have sound policy reasons for the kind of informed policy choices that we need to make in a democratic society. It's only after we think through the reasons for what we're going to do that we can assure ourselves that we'll be on the best possible course for wise, serious political and policy choices. This is what we need much more than what purports to be the television spectacle. Secondly, I want to talk for just a moment about the extraordinary importance of this kind of issue. Anybody who's even remotely cognizant of what's going on in the world knows just how a significant moral issue this really is. I've had the opportunity of spending a great deal of time in recent years in Europe. I've seen the impact of this on the European continent. I've spent a lot of time in Germany and the Netherlands where this has had a huge impact, and it can have a huge impact here. Whatever one's view, one ought to think through very carefully about the complexity of these issues. There are issues, as has been pointed out, of moral responsibility here. There are issues about how do you vet the people who may be coming in here? How do you deal with the kind of cultural adaptation of people with very, very different linguistic, cultural, and religious traditions? I think it's doable, but these are issues that need to be properly debated. And these kinds of forums allow us to think through the kinds of issues that are that must be done. But clearly, the plight of the refugees in this world, which Syria is at the forefront, need to be carefully thought out. These issues will not go away, and it's time for us in the United States to think about these with great clarity if we're going to assume our responsibility as a moral leadership. Two other comments I want to make. I really am particularly pleased that we have visitors from China involved in this. This kind of cultural exchange is supremely important in my judgment. It is really nice to see an American debate team really mix it up with people from China. And I would like to see much more of this kind of exchange at the cultural level. I've been involved a little bit in the visual arts in that. And the more of this that we can have, the better off our globe will be. And finally, I would like to see this kind of debate continue with other cultures, not only China, but all over Asia, all over Latin America, Africa, and a wide variety. Then we will have the kind of world where we can truly have the kind of intercultural communication that we really need to have. Thank you all very much.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Paul. I would just want to second those comments and say that I certainly believe that it's better to have debated a question and not settled it than settle the question and not debated it, and Paul certainly has reflected that sentiment perfectly. Thank you all for coming. If you want more information about the UCLA debate program, you may go to the UCLAdebateunion.com and you'll find information about us on the web. Thank you so much for coming. And might I just say one more thing? We have law school classes going on, so if you could be extra courteous and respectful as you leave the building, we'd like to be real silent and be good neighbors as we leave our area here today. Thank you again for coming.
I'm sorry I missed much of the debate. We have one of these inevitable time conflicts. I have my student papers due in 2 weeks, and I had a line of students who needed the consultation. They didn't really need consultation, they just needed me to pat them on the head and say that their papers are proceeding very nicely. Anyway, a couple of very brief comments. I will in fact be brief. I want to thank all of you for participating in this, and I want to thank the Communication Studies Department for sponsoring this, and I want to thank Tom Miller for extraordinary work in guiding the debate team for so many years. A couple of general observations about this. This kind of enterprise is very important. It promotes debate, which is what we need a lot more of instead of screaming at each other. I think some of you may have watched the recent television spectacles of people pretending to be debating and in fact doing something very, very different. Even though I was not here for the past hour, I assume that nobody screamed at each other and said that each of you was a liar. I assume that nobody during today's presentation threatened to sue one another. So I assume that all of this was done at a much higher level of discourse. And I think we, in fact, need to have much, much more of this kind of reasoned debate. That's why we do debate, so that we can have sound policy reasons for the kind of informed policy choices that we need to make in a democratic society. It's only after we think through the reasons for what we're going to do that we can assure ourselves that we'll be on the best possible course for wise, serious political and policy choices. This is what we need much more than what purports to be the television spectacle. Secondly, I want to talk for just a moment about the extraordinary importance of this kind of issue. Anybody who's even remotely cognizant of what's going on in the world knows just how a significant moral issue this really is. I've had the opportunity of spending a great deal of time in recent years in Europe. I've seen the impact of this on the European continent. I've spent a lot of time in Germany and the Netherlands where this has had a huge impact, and it can have a huge impact here. Whatever one's view, one ought to think through very carefully about the complexity of these issues. There are issues, as has been pointed out, of moral responsibility here. There are issues about how do you vet the people who may be coming in here? How do you deal with the kind of cultural adaptation of people with very, very different linguistic, cultural, and religious traditions? I think it's doable, but these are issues that need to be properly debated. And these kinds of forums allow us to think through the kinds of issues that are that must be done. But clearly, the plight of the refugees in this world, which Syria is at the forefront, need to be carefully thought out. These issues will not go away. And it's time for us in the United States to think about these with great clarity if we're going to assume our responsibility as a moral leadership. Two other comments I want to make. I really am particularly pleased that we have visitors from China involved in this. This kind of cultural exchange is supremely important in my judgment. It is really nice to see an American debate team really mix it up with people from China. And I would like to see much more of this kind of exchange at the cultural level. I've been involved a little bit in the visual arts in that. And the more of this that we can have, the better off our globe will be. And finally, I would like to see this kind of debate continue with other cultures, not only China, but all over Asia, all over Latin America, Africa, and a wide variety. Then we will have the kind of world where we can truly have the kind of intercultural communication that we really need to have. Thank you all very much.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Paul. I would just want to second those comments and say that I certainly believe that it's better to have debated a question and not settled it than settled a question and not debated it, and Paul certainly has reflected that sentiment perfectly. Thank you all for coming. If you want more information about the UCLA debate program, you may go to the UCLAdebateunion.com and you'll find information about us on the web. Thank you so much for coming. And might I just say one more thing? We have law school classes going on, so if you could be extra courteous and respectful as you leave the building, we'd like to be real silent and be good neighbors as we leave our area here today. Thank you again for coming.